Welcome back. I hope you had a good break and have maybe digested some of what we've been discussing together, but particularly what has allowed you through the meditation to perhaps touch some of these ideas in a somewhat more grounded way. What we're going to do in this seminar is look at what I've translated here. If you look at your this thing, we're still on number 1, and as we saw this morning, we had the 4 foundations of mindfulness. Now we're going to have the 4 strategic efforts. And tomorrow morning, we'll look at the 4 bases of creativity. But let's first of all just go back to the overall path or task that we're looking at the moment. So go to column 1, and you'll see the path is called formation. The task is embracing life. Then there's a vow. I'll come to that in a minute. And then I've also added other associative elements, the 4 elements, the colors, the seasons. And some of these things are not at all traditional. They're just associations that I find work somehow within this model that I pick up from both Buddhist and non-Buddhist sources. So take this thing with a pinch of salt. It's a work in progress. It's somewhat speculative. It's based on early Buddhist ideas, but it's real. It's organized in a way that would not be familiar to most Buddhists. So when we talk about the first task of embracing life, which is a more idiomatic way of saying comprehending dukkha or suffering, embracing life, I feel, gives a more positive reading of this task. It's not reducing all life to suffering, but it is acknowledging that built into the very fabric of life itself, there is suffering. But I think suffering is not so much the result of our grasping and our craving and our ignorance and so on, but suffering as simply an unavoidable element within a life that is impermanent and contingent. That we find ourselves thrown into this world, we emerge into consciousness, and as we become conscious, we also become aware that we're going to die. That this wonderful world, let's hope it's a wonderful world, into which we've been born, is also one that's going to kick us out very unceremoniously at a time of its choosing. Might be tomorrow, might be, in my case, 20 years, 30 years' time, who knows? But the point is that at one point, it'll all stop. One of the most powerful meditations that I did as a Tibetan Buddhist monk was the meditation, the reflection on death. And I did this every day for a number of years, particularly when I was a monastic. And that is to recollect, to remember, to be mindful of the certainty of death, that death is the only thing that is certain in this life, the only thing that we can be sure about that is going to happen in the future. Everything else is uncertain. But the time of this one certain thing is totally uncertain. So we get this curious intersection between radical certainty and radical uncertainty. That's the condition in which we find ourselves. And this is a condition in which we will not be able to get everything we want. This is a condition that is not one that is designed according to what I like and I might aspire to. It's a condition in which we are constantly in conflict with others who have the same desires as us, for a job or for a partner or for a house or for whatever it might be. So dukkha, I feel, is just built into this particular way that life has organized itself. We can certainly not be so made so anxious and worried about this. We don't have to compulsively think about these sorts of things all the time. We can certainly let go of a lot of mental habits that cause us unnecessary anguish and distress. And again, mindfulness practices, Buddhist practices, I think, are quite good at doing that. But that doesn't alter the fundamental reality that we are here for only a very brief time, subject to forces outside of our control, with no real understanding why we're here or what it's for. And yet, we have within us a very deep yearning for happiness, a very deep yearning for love, a deep yearning to be part of a community, a deep yearning to see the first spring flowers every year. And yet those yearnings at one point will cease. Either we won't be able to get those things anymore, or something will come about that causes us to get sick and to die. So there's something tragic about the human condition. This is not to say that human existence is just misery through and through. It's not. Obviously, it's not. But there's something essential, I feel, about what it means to be human, which involves facing and accepting and embracing this condition. I was quite influenced by a book called Sein und Zeit by Martin Heidegger. And there he gives a meditation or analysis of death that is just as powerful as anything I've come across in Buddhism. He talks of life as being zur Todessein. It's a being towards death in English. That is simply, what's going on. Every breath we take and are conscious of is one breath less of all the breaths we're ever going to take. So it's not just a way of seeing things that we find in certain religions or in Buddhism, but also I think it's a perspective that opens up as soon as we start thinking more seriously about what it means to be the kind of person we are. It can be very difficult and challenging to think about these things, but I feel that in the end, if we're able to really look life in the face and say yes, including sickness, including aging, including death, these things can't really be separated out. That is a foundation, I feel, for leading a life in which we'll take into full account the limited time we have left. Maybe in one of the meditations, I'll I'll take you through that reflection if you're interested. It might be a nice thing to do, maybe tomorrow morning. So from that perspective, when we say embracing suffering or embracing life, we're talking about paying much closer attention to the totality of our existence, not just our breath or sensations in our knees, but to be mindful of the fact that we've been born and that we will die. In Chinese Buddhism, they call this the great matter of birth and death. But this embracing has clearly got something to do with mindfulness, which we looked at this morning. To take into account the totality of my existence means that I start paying closer attention to the totality of my existence. I pay more attention to my body. I pay more attention to my feelings. I pay more attention to my mental states. I start paying more attention to what I hear and smell and sense and touch. So clearly we can understand without much difficulty why mindfulness is a very important part of being able to embrace our life fully. But according to this model, this embrace also includes making a certain kind of effort. It's not passive, in other words. It's not just sitting on a cushion mindfully noticing everything. But there's also involved in this a kind of commitment or a resolution, or how I've translated it here, the need for some kind of strategic effort. By strategic, I mean thinking in terms of the purpose of my life as a whole and how I might best realize that aspiration, what it is I seek to do in this life. Not just about getting a particular task or bit of business done in a day or two, making an effort to do that, but actually what kind of effort do I make to be a fully human, ethical person? It's that kind of effort we're talking about. And again, in English, we maybe don't think so much in those terms. But in a sense, what we're looking at here, I think, is what moves us most deeply to engage with life. It's a part of us that is, in a way, much more concerned that has a concern, a souci about how to live. It's that kind of effort. This also involves, according to this model, entering into a creative and an imaginative relationship with life. So we are mindful, we focus and commit ourselves to achieve certain goals in our life, effort, and we do so through not just paying attention, but also through activating our imagination, our creative potential. That's something we'll look at tomorrow morning. Now, perhaps a clue to understand how these different things go together, mindfulness, effort, and creativity. It might be helpful just to reflect a bit on the name of the path itself, which is traditionally called the Sambhaga Marga in Sanskrit, or the path of formation. You'll notice that each of the tasks is connected to a path: formation, unification, vision, and cultivation. Again, you don't find this stated quite like this in the Pali texts, in the Theravada tradition, but you find it in the Sarvastivada tradition, which was an early school of Buddhism in northern India, in Kashmir and Bengal particularly, and what's now Pakistan, Gandhara. And this was a parallel tradition to the Theravada that had ideas in it that are very similar to Theravada Buddhism, but also some ideas that you don't find in the Pali Canon. And one of these ideas, I think a very central idea, is the idea of these four paths. The path of formation, the path of unification, the path of vision, and the path of cultivation. So in this perspective, mindfulness, effort, and creativity are seen as part of how we form ourselves. I think this is not too terribly different from the German concept of Bildung. Bildung in the classical sense of an education that involves the whole of our being, that cultivates and refines a certain cultural sensibility, a range of skills, be they poetry, be they science. But this is how we somehow are formed into the kind of person we are through the educational processes, through the processes of socialization in our culture, through the processes also of how we're exposed to our religions, our traditional religions, our philosophies, our beliefs. All of these things that we absorb during our younger years are what effectively helps us become the sort of person we are. We make choices, we have preferences, we seek different kinds of careers and work in the world. And all of this, I think, has to do with formation or Bildung. And as we saw with the example of the wood turner this morning, this rather curious example of a person of how to watch your breath, you do it like a wood turner turns a piece of wood. I think here too, this embracing life is to be thought of as a kind of knowing that's more like a know-how, a skill, a felt, intuitive, bodily understanding, rather than a conceptual or an intellectual knowledge, a knowledge of facts, a knowledge which is full of information, a knowledge arrived at by very careful reasoning. That's not to be dismissed, but it's only part of a bigger picture. And in the practice of the Dharma, I feel it's the refinement of these kind of embodied know-hows and skills that serve us in becoming practicing human beings, and not just the knowledge that comes with what we have learned from what people have taught us, and so on. And I think this is true, as we've already seen, with a musician, for example. A musician will have to learn about the theories of music, will have to read the notations, will have to develop certain technical skills to play instruments. But at the end of the day, that formation allows them to forget the formation and simply express and explore these internalized know-hows that they have come to possess. And that, I think, is, again, a better example for what is being meant here than thinking of it purely in terms of understanding certain Buddhist truths by means of meditation. Again, that's part of it, but it's not the whole picture. I think this whole way of looking at things in terms of formation, embracing life, is a way of trying to render the practice of the Dharma more holistic. In other words, it's a practice that incorporates all of who we are, not just our spiritual bit, which is probably in our mind somewhere or in our heart, some inner training. Again, I think historically Buddhism has shifted into an increasingly introspective understanding of practice. It's about gaining insight into the true nature of mind or understanding the nature of emptiness. Again, which are valuable things, no doubt, but they tend to say, well, this is what really matters, and the rest is just relative or conventional truth. Whereas here I feel we're not making that split. We're not giving certain things ultimate importance, like emptiness or mind or something, but actually seeking to integrate these different dimensions into a whole, into a totality that responds to the organic complexity of who we are. So strategic effort is strategic because it has to do with the totality of how we live, not just one aspect of our lives, our spiritual life, for example. And that's another reason why I feel a word like eudaimonia, or human flourishing, captures well the kind of project that this practice is seeking to realize. So let's look more carefully at this idea of strategic effort. I'm actually changing my mind on that, by the way. I'm thinking more now in terms of resolve. You know what that means in German? Resolve? It's entschlossen, yeah, something like that. Resolution. And one of the reasons that I've thought of it in that way is because there is, in the Sutta Nipata, which is one of the earliest collections of Buddhist texts in Pali, we have a text called the Pardana Sutta, the discourse on pardana, or strategic effort, or resolve. But what this sutta, what this discourse contains, is the story of the Buddha's struggling for enlightenment. And it starts with the Buddha, you know that famous image of the Buddha who's the fasting Buddha he's just all skin and bones, and he's locked in meditation, and he's not going to give up until he's reached his goal. It's a beautiful myth, really. But it does point very strongly to how this whole tradition emerged out of one man making certain resolutions. I'm not going to rise up from this seat until the nature of reality is clear to me, or something like that. There is very much this incredible sense of commitment and resolve that drives this process. In fact, in the Zen tradition today, you have what's called the Rohatsu Sesshin, the sesshin that is done to commemorate the Buddha's enlightenment, is that you sit for 7 days with the same degree of resolution that the Buddha himself exhibited at his time. But this resolve is only one side of the story. The other side of the story is renunciation. In other words, the Pardana Sutta, this description of this account of the Buddha's renunciation and his struggle to awaken, involves, on the one hand, a resolve, a struggle. On the other hand, it involves leaving something behind, renunciation. In other words, in his case, the story is that he left his wife and his child and his community and his family, and he buggered off and went and studied meditation with all these different people and studied philosophy and so on. And he did so partly because he could no longer tolerate the kind of life he was living. In other words, he made a radical break with his society, with his family, his community, and then dedicated himself to this other vision of what a human life could be. Now, today we live in a society where this kind of renunciation is maybe looked upon a little bit uncomfortably. Leaving one's children would not be considered today a terribly virtuous or good thing to do. But I don't think we should judge the Buddha by the standards of our time. I don't want to get into this whole story because it can go on and on. But however we look at it, if we embark with complete seriousness on a practice of the Dharma that we're looking at here, that also means that we're probably cutting ourselves off, or we're moving away from another way of being in the world that has proven somehow not to be fulfilling. We maybe get to a point in one's life where we don't really feel we've accomplished what we might. We also see that we're getting older and that time is going faster and faster. And it's often at those crisis points that we say, I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm going to leave my job, maybe leave a relationship, whatever it might be, in order to dedicate myself to something else that I do with full consciousness and awareness and commitment. So this is the kind of effort we're talking about here. Roughly speaking, if we look at this, let's say more psychologically now, it's about the renunciation not of a wife and a child. It's about renouncing repetitive habits of mind. It's about letting go of a certain way of being, a certain pattern of behavior that doesn't seem to get us anywhere. We might have this funny feeling sometimes. We've been embarked on a big project. We've expended a huge amount of energy. We get the job done. It's quite successful. And then a few days later, we look back on it and we say, yeah, okay, that was well done. But at another level, I don't really feel as I've accomplished much, to be honest. I'm still much the same. World hasn't really changed significantly. We have the feeling sometimes that we're just elements in a bigger machine. And although we do good things and create good solutions to problems, nonetheless, existentially, we feel that we've not really moved on. Again, we have this, I have still this feeling very much. I still have the feeling sometimes when I wake up in the middle of the night that I'm still that 5-year-old boy, confused, wondering what to do with himself, anxious. In some ways, I feel that I've got older, but I haven't really grown in some ways. And again, I think if we read literature or of all traditions, we'll find, we find this kind of insight occurring all over the place. So we renounce a life of repetition, of just repeating the same things again and again, and really not getting anywhere, despite all the energy we expend. We keep coming back to the same point. And this is more a feeling than anything else. It's a strong sort of feeling of stasis, of circularity. Now, we spoke at the beginning of this morning about the idea of a path, an eightfold path, or a middle way. And a path is essentially the opposite of a circle. A circle, repetition, goes round and round. A path has a beginning, and it takes us off into somewhere unknown, not familiar, not a place we've been before. To embark on a path is to embark on a journey. And we know in many traditions, in and most myths, in fact, are to a large extent about describing a journey. People have written about this, like Joseph Campbell and others in English. But this brings us again back to this original idea. What's the difference between being on a path and not going round in circles, and going round in circles and not really feeling we're getting anywhere? The sense of path here is a break with a life of repetition. Now, in classical Indian religious language, this circularity is called Sansara. And this is often understood as rebirth. You know, you get born, you grow old, you die, you get reborn, you grow old, you die, you get reborn, you get old, you die. And if you don't do anything about that, it'll go on forever. And according to Buddhist philosophy and Hindu beliefs, this process has been going on since beginningless time. In other words, hell of a long time. It's a condition of that's never been otherwise. So Sansara, we could understand it in that large cosmological multi-lifetime way that traditionally religious people in India understand it. But we could also understand it as the cycles of habitual belief and behavior and thinking and acting that we're locked into from moment to moment, from day to day. That's, I think, what we're going to be addressing in a secular approach to the Dharma, or a secular approach to Sansara. Sansara is no longer multiple lifetimes, which that might be the case. I've absolutely no idea. But in terms of what we can address here and now, it's about addressing these inner patterns of deadening reactivity. And this allows us to come to the idea of reactivity. Reactivity basically is a kind of endless, it's eine Teufelskreis. It's a vicious circle, a devil's circle, in which we feel ourselves trapped. But Sansara is not actually the opposite of nirvana, although that's what you find in a lot of Buddhist teaching. You have Sansara and nirvana. You know, they're two different poles of experience. Whereas, in fact, I feel what is opposite of Sansara, the circle, is the path itself. It's the Eightfold Path. The Eightfold Path might emerge from nirvana or a non-reactive space, but the path is more than just being non-reactive. It's about flourishing as fully as one can as a person and as a society. But it's the opposite of Sansara. Samsara just keeps things going on endlessly without much change. I think these four strategic efforts, or these four resolves, are basically another version of the four tasks. And if when we go through them, I think you'll probably see how that is the case. But what it points to is that the tasks, the four tasks, are not simply things to do, but they're also somehow commitments or resolutions or even vows. And that's where we come in the third item on these four lists. We have a vow. And the vow in this first task is sentient beings are boundless. I vow to liberate them all. This is a text taken from the Zen tradition. But what is curious about it is, I feel, how closely it maps onto the idea of the four tasks. Again, it emphasizes the fact that this is not just a short-term exercise, but it's actually making a commitment in terms of how we live our lives at the most basic, fundamental level. If sentient beings are in fact boundless, as the text says, then obviously I'm not going to be able to solve that problem myself and free them all from suffering. And yet I vow to liberate them all. This is the paradox at the heart of this, that one seeks to live a life in which you embrace the world as fully as you can and seek to respond to its suffering, but at the same time, you have to recognize that in the 20 or 30 years that you've got left on Earth, with the limitations you have anyway, you're not going to make much of a dent in the suffering of all sentient beings. But that doesn't matter. What matters is that one embraces this suffering because it is suffering and because it is addressing you. It's our world. And to respond to that at the same level of urgency and passion requires maybe a non-rational response. I think immediately, and I'm sure some of you do too, when we're facing the possibility of human extinction, possibly within this century, if we do not resolve the crisis around our climate, our environmental crisis. So again, you or I individually are not going to solve that problem, but it's nonetheless something that we need to, I feel, be more and more aware of and conscious of, and continually ask ourselves, how can we live on Earth if that is what we're doing? How can I get in a plane if that's going to contribute to the melting of the ice caps? This is our real existential challenge as a society, and not just European, as a global family, as a global society. And I feel it needs a response that comes from that deep well of concern that is within not only us individually, but in our community, in the world of our time. So let's look at this. Let's try to sort of get a sense of how these efforts are working. First of all, I think we need to understand how these resolutions support each other. They're not four separate things. And we can, one day we'll practice one and the other day the next. They are intimately related one to the other, just as the four tasks are intimately related one to the other. And the principle according to which these tasks and these efforts are connected is the principle of conditionality itself. Again, some of you are probably familiar with this idea, others maybe less so. But the earliest account of the Buddha's awakening explains how he understood two basic facts of life. The first fact of life he called conditionality, paticca samuppada, sometimes translated as abhängiger Entstehen, a conditioned arising, which is a bit of a mouthful. Basically what it means, as the Buddha himself said, when this is, that arises. When this is not, that does not arise. It's similar in a sense to the law of cause and effect, basically. What Gautama understood was how the world was radically contingent and conditional, both his own body-mind as well as the external world he shared with others. That nothing remains, everything is changing, and it's not changing in a chaotic, random fashion, but it's changing according to natural laws. As the Buddhists say, if you plant a seed of rice, you will get a sprout of rice. You won't get a mango tree. This conditionality is lawful. But there's no room in it for something that is outside the conditioned world, some non-conditioned figure like God, for example. The Buddha opened up to the world as radically conditioned, conditional, contingent. And the second, and that's his first fact of life, contingency. The second fact of life is that we can experience the stopping of reactivity. In other words, we can cultivate a space within us as a human being in which we're not pushed and pulled by our habits, our reactive patterns, but we can experience moments in which we're free from those things even when they're still around. I can experience, if we do mindfulness, I can experience my anxiety, but it has no more any power or less power over me. I'm not any longer so much a victim of these mental states. I've found a way to live with them. And in doing so, by not feeding those patterns, over time, they tend to diminish. So the four tasks operate along the same logic, as do the four efforts. In other words, if the embracing of life is the condition on which it then becomes possible to let go of my reactive patterns. To let go of reactivity is the condition that allows reactivity to come to a stop. And the stopping of reactivity, this inner nirvanic space, is the condition that allows us to respond thoughtfully and wisely and compassionately to life and suffering, rather than just reacting as we normally might do. We might come back to this principle of conditionality again, but here we see quite clearly that, or at least for me clearly, that these four tasks are an enactment, an expression of the principle of conditionality. And likewise, the four strategic efforts, which are about creating conditions for reactivity not to arise, to create conditions for the letting go of reactivity, to create conditions for positive states of mind to arise, and to create conditions for sustaining and increasing these skillful states of mind, these virtues. To create conditions for reactivity not to rise is basically to embrace life. If we embrace life with the kind of mindfulness we were speaking of this morning, we do so with a quality of openness, of acceptance, of love, of generosity, of wisdom. So this embrace is one in which we establish another relationship with ourselves and with the world. And by establishing that kind of relationship, we undermine the conditions that reinforce our reactive habits. And it's a bit abstract, but does that make sense? More or less. But again, think it through for yourselves. The idea of effort here in Buddhism is that effort is not about sort of, gritting your teeth and forcing yourself to do something. There's not, the idea of effort is about making, pushing ourselves, maybe pushing ourselves beyond our limits. We often think of that as effort. Make more effort, I was told as a school child. Doesn't try hard enough. Teacher's report. And what that we understand as meaning is you're not motivated enough. You don't push yourself enough. The Buddha's understanding of effort is really rather different. He's basically saying, if you aspire for something good, like, for example, being less reactive, it's no good just telling yourself, be less reactive. Don't, give in to your wandering thoughts, which, as a meditation instructor, you kind of have to say that. But as we probably know, just for me to tell myself, don't be reactive, is not going to make any difference. Because reactions are not things under our control anyway. They spring up. So what we can do, instead of trying to force reality to fit our desire, is we can start living differently. That when we encounter a situation in life, we don't let our attractions and aversions, our wants, our fears dictate what we're doing. That's often how it works. We go into a work situation, for example, and it triggers all kinds of stuff within us. Oh, I don't like that person. Oh, he's going to be difficult. This is really a problem, blah, blah, blah. So if we let our lives be, as it were, just run on this kind of programming that's built into us, then it's going to be quite ineffective to just tell ourselves, don't be angry. To say don't be angry when all of the conditions for you to be angry are there. And what that leads to is either we suppress it or we pretend, but we build up inside ourselves resentment and dislike and fear, and we're really pissed off and so on. That approach won't work. Effort has to do with making a consistent effort to change the conditions of how we live. And once those conditions begin to change, once we get used to being more mindful, let's say, when we begin to appreciate how all beings are going to die like we are, that vision of the world, that sense of the world, has a consequence of making attachment and fear and desire less and less, not only attractive, but they make less and less sense. We feel less and less inclined to follow that path. We see it rising up, anger, whoosh. But with mindfulness, we just say, oh, anger has arisen. I can see this happening. It's part of who I am. It's a natural condition. There's nothing wrong with it. But if I follow that impulse, I'm not going to achieve the kind of world I wish or the kind of person I wish to be. So this is a gradual process. There may be moments in which there are sudden breakthroughs, but basically this is a long-term commitment. So we'll just go through this once again. Creating conditions for reactivity not to arise is to enter into a non-reactive relationship to life. And the more we learn to live in a more gentle, kind, and non-reactive way, the more that will lead to the letting go of reactivity, which is the second task. And the more that we get used to letting reactivity just come and go, rather than us constantly hitching a ride on it, the more the non-reactive space will open up. In other words, letting go of reactivity or creating the conditions for letting go of reactivity will lead to a non-reactive space, something we experience in meditation, perhaps, certain moments in the day, but that space starts to become more and more where we are through our practice. And it's the cultivation of that non-reactivity that is the condition that allows virtues to arise, which is the third effort. But effort sounds kind of wrong now. It's not really an effort. It's a resolve, perhaps. Difficult to find the right word in English. And by cultivating this non-reactive space, that is the condition that allows, as I said, virtues to arise. But what that might mean in ordinary English is that's the condition that allows us to switch from being purely reactive to being responsive. In other words, not being driven by impulse and habit, but having the space to reflect and to make choices and decisions as to what to do, to take into account the complexity of the situation, and then having the courage to risk saying or doing something in that situation, which of course might make things worse. We don't know. But without acting, we won't be moving forward in our lives at all. So that, at least, is a sketch of what these four strategic efforts are about. And I hope you can see how this is connected to the practice of mindfulness, because it provides mindfulness with a kind of raison d'être. If we have a sense of what we are aspiring for, what our motives are, what our goals might be, through these four efforts, through these four tasks, then that helps us get a much clearer sense of why we practice mindfulness. I think this always has to be in the back of my mind. Why am I practicing mindfulness or Vipassana or Dzogchen, whatever it might be? Why? Is it because my teacher told me to? Is it because I think it's somehow cool? Or do I do it because I understand how it fits into this vision of life that originated with this man called Gautama and has given rise to this tradition, which is 2,500 years old? finally, another take on effort that I've found personally very helpful that I'd like to share is an account of effort or strategic effort or resolve that we find in a text by Shantideva, who's an 8th century Indian Mahayana monk. And it's called the Bodhicharya Avatara, the Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. And in the 7th chapter of that book, it's translated into German, you'll find a chapter on effort. And Shantideva, though, doesn't follow this model, but he does come up with also 4 aspects of what he considers to be appropriate effort. And I'll just read them, I'll just mention them, we won't go into any detail. For him, effort is, in order to make a genuine, sincere effort to do something, you need to be clear about what you want, what your aspiration is, what sort of person you want to be, what kind of life you want to lead, to be clear about that. And Shantideva likewise brings in death. Just the best way to become clear about what you want is to appreciate how little time you have. That focuses the mind. The second aspect of this kind of strategic effort is self-confidence. Again, not an idea that you find in Buddhism that widely. And curiously, Shantideva uses the word mana for self-confidence, which is usually treated as pride, which is one of the bad guys. It's mana, self-importance, egoism. And Shantideva plays with the difference between self-importance and self-confidence. He uses the same one word, mana, but in its different context, it means slightly different things. He says, the truly self-confident person is the one who has overcome self-importance. So in Sanskrit, it will read, the person with mana is the person who has overcome mana. In English, it wouldn't work. So self-confidence, in other words, having a very positive sense of one's own capacities and abilities. It's an inner strength, this self-confidence, is to be proud and confident of what you're doing. That often gets lost in Buddhist humility and deference and so on. And then the third one is joy, that applying oneself to live in this way makes you happy. It's fulfilling. It might be hard work at times. It might be a real pain in the neck sometimes to do these things. But at the end of the day, it begins to result in a life that is felt to be more fully alive. There's a kind of joy in that. And Shantideva uses beautiful images. He says the bodhisattva, he says, applies himself to his task in the way that a child looks forward to going out to play. So kids don't have to make an effort to go and play with their friends. They do it naturally. And yet they expend a lot of energy, hard work, but it's nothing but joy and fun. So that's another dimension that in the Pali tradition we don't quite get. And curiously, this is a good point to end, the fourth dimension of effort for Shantideva is called rest. In other words, knowing when to stop. I think that's a big problem in our society. We become compulsively workaholics, compulsive. I'm a bit like that. I always wanted to do something. Shantideva is saying, no, you need to notice when you've expended your available energy, and rather than push yourself into nervous energy, you stop, you enjoy yourself, you relax, you chill, go and see a movie, have a glass of alcohol-free wine or something. Okay, so let's stop here for today. Now, we're going to break you now. I'm going to break you now into groups. And I'd like you to gather together in little groups of 5. Is that what we said? 4 groups of 5 in the dining room, because it's a nice big space and we can just sit around 4 different tables and explore what you've learned today, what has stuck with you, what has in your mind that you feel has maybe helped you understand something. But if you're having a totally negative experience, talk about that. It's not a problem. So we're going to do this for 45 minutes. We'll do this every day, and we'll try and get the groups to be as mixed as possible, but